Harry didn't just hear the words, he felt the door slam. Because this time, it wasn't a rumor whispered through palace corridors, it wasn't a cold shoulder at a public event, it wasn't even a subtle signal hidden behind royal silence. This time, it was something far more brutal, far more final, and according to insiders, far more calculated than anything that has come before a new Spencer rule. Quietly enforced, quietly agreed upon, and devastating in its implications, Meghan no longer welcome at future Althorp events. And the shock didn't come from strangers, it came from blood. Behind the manicured lawns of Montecito, where the image is carefully controlled and the narrative is constantly rewritten, something had already been unraveling for weeks, long before this alleged rule surfaced, because insiders were noticing the same pattern repeating itself again and again: the growing distance, the unanswered messages, the delayed responses from the Spencer side, and most importantly, the silence where there used to be access. That silence, according to those watching closely, wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, because Althorp is not just a location, it is not just a symbolic place, it is the heart of something far older than titles, far deeper than public sympathy, and far more guarded than anything the California brand could ever fully understand: a legacy built over generations, protected by tradition, and controlled by one man who has never treated it like a public stage. And that is exactly where everything began to fracture. Sources close to the situation claim that what started as a request, a seemingly simple idea tied to future events, private visits, and potential involvement around Diana's legacy, quickly turned into something much bigger, something that raised alarms inside the Spencer circle. Because it wasn't just about remembrance anymore, it was about control. And control at Althorp is not negotiable. The moment that realization hit, everything shifted. The tone changed. The openness vanished. And what insiders are now describing is a turning point so sharp, so unexpected, that even Harry didn't see it coming. Because while he has always had a complicated relationship with the past, he never expected the line to be drawn here. Not by them. Not like this. Because according to multiple whispers circulating among royal observers, the new internal understanding is clear: future events connected to Althorp, especially those tied to Diana's memory, will be handled strictly within the Spencer framework, with tighter oversight, fewer external influences, and a level of exclusivity that effectively closes the door on anything perceived as external narrative shaping. And that is where Meghan's name reportedly surfaced. Not publicly, not officially, but in conversations that mattered, in discussions that carried weight, in moments where decisions were being made not for headlines, but for history. Because from the Spencer perspective, as one insider allegedly described, this isn't about personal dislike, it isn't about public drama, it isn't even about past interviews or media storms, it is about something much colder, much more structured: the protection of a legacy that cannot be repackaged, reinterpreted, or repurposed for modern storytelling. And that belief has been growing stronger, quietly, steadily, until it reached a point where boundaries had to be enforced. The kind of boundaries that don't come with press releases, the kind that don't get announced, the kind that simply exist, and once they exist, they don't move. For Harry, this is where the real tension begins, because while the outside world sees headlines and speculation, what insiders are describing is something far more personal: a collision between loyalty and reality, between his role as Diana's son and the fact that her legacy in that space is not his alone to navigate. And that realization is hitting harder than expected, because for years there has been an assumption, subtle, unspoken, but always present, that access to Diana's memory would remain open, that the connection would never be questioned, that the doors of Althorp, no matter how guarded, would never fully close to him. But this feels different. This feels like a shift that is not temporary, a shift that is not emotional, a shift that is structural. And when something becomes structural, it stops being negotiable. What makes it even more intense is the timing, because this development isn't happening in isolation, it's unfolding against a backdrop of increasing scrutiny, mounting pressure, and a growing narrative that everything connected to Diana is becoming more tightly controlled, more carefully filtered, and more fiercely protected than ever before. And right at the center of that tightening circle is Althorp, the place where history isn't just remembered, it is guarded. The place where decisions are not made for headlines, they are made for generations. And now, according to what insiders are hinting at, the rules of that space have changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. And for the first time, those changes appear to be affecting who gets to stand inside those gates and who doesn't. Because what started as a quiet shift is now being described as something far more serious: a line drawn, a boundary reinforced, and a message sent without a single public statement. And that question doesn't just linger, it tightens. Because what insiders are now quietly piecing together is that this wasn't a sudden emotional reaction. It wasn't a dramatic fallout triggered overnight. It was something that had been building in layers, slowly, carefully, almost invisibly, until it reached a point where the Spencer side no longer saw flexibility as an option but as a risk, because from their perspective, every step taken in recent years had led to one unavoidable conclusion: that the legacy of Diana was being pulled into a space they could no longer control, and once that line was crossed, it could never be reversed, which is why the response that followed was not loud, not public, but deeply decisive. The kind of response that doesn't need to be explained because its impact is felt immediately. Inside Montecito, that impact reportedly hit with a force that few expected, because while the public narrative has always been shaped around independence and new beginnings, the private reality, according to those watching closely, has always depended on a delicate thread: the continued connection to the past, the continued proximity to Diana's memory, the continued access to the places that still hold her presence. And when that thread begins to fray, everything around it starts to shift, not visibly at first, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that accumulate until they can no longer be ignored. And that is exactly where this situation appears to be heading now. Because what makes this development so different, so much heavier than previous tensions, is the fact that it doesn't revolve around palace politics or media disputes. It revolves around something far more personal and far more immovable: ownership of memory, ownership of narrative, ownership of history itself. And in that space, the Spencer position has always been unyielding, as reflected in the broader pattern that has been unfolding behind the scenes, where attempts to build projects, shape stories, or even suggest collaborations have repeatedly met with resistance, not always publicly, not always directly, but consistently enough to form a clear picture of where the boundaries lie, boundaries that have only become stricter over time as the stakes have grown higher. For Harry, this creates a conflict that cannot be easily resolved, because it is no longer about navigating public perception or responding to criticism. It is about confronting a reality where the space that holds his mother's legacy is no longer fully accessible in the way he once believed it to be. And that realization carries a weight that goes beyond headlines, beyond speculation, into something much deeper, something that challenges the very foundation of how he connects to that past. Because while he remains her son, while his bond to her remains unquestioned, the authority over how her story is preserved, presented, and protected does not rest with him alone. And that distinction is now becoming impossible to ignore. At the same time, the silence from the Spencer side continues, and that silence is not empty, it is deliberate, it is controlled, it is strategic, because by saying nothing, by refusing to engage publicly, by allowing the narrative to unfold without confirmation or denial, they maintain the strongest position possible, one that does not invite negotiation, one that does not leave room for reinterpretation, one that simply exists as a fact within their world. And that approach has proven to be far more powerful than any public statement could ever be, because it shifts the entire balance without ever appearing to do so. What intensifies the situation even further is the growing sense among observers that this is not just about one decision or one moment, but about a broader alignment that has been forming quietly, one that reinforces the same principle again and again: that Diana's legacy will not be opened, will not be expanded, will not be reshaped beyond the control of those who have always guarded it. And that principle now appears to be stronger than ever, closing ranks in a way that leaves little room for external influence, no matter how closely connected that influence may seem from the outside. And as this realization settles in, the consequences begin to ripple outward, because if access to Althorp becomes more restricted, if involvement in future events becomes more limited, if participation in anything tied to that space is quietly filtered, then the entire dynamic shifts, not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the broader narrative that has been built around them, a narrative that has relied, at least in part, on that connection remaining open, remaining accessible, remaining real.